hopefully that will give you some background. For a lot of you, I think this will be, government 101, and you've known this for a long time. But for some of you, I think hopefully I'll be answering questions that you've had or maybe didn't even know to ask. So let's take a look at this. And there are a number of the kind of mysteries that are out there, like, for example, this one. What is a primary election? How is that different from another kind of election? Why do we have primary elections? Another question, are there different kinds of primaries? Well, actually, we'll see that there are, in fact. What is a caucus? A caucus, as it'll turn out, is an alternative to a primary. But I'll talk a little bit more about what both of those are. But that's a term that I think many people are sort of mystified by. Another question, what is the Electoral College? And how does that function in the American system of choosing a president? And why do we have that system? In that sense, I mean the totality of all those things that I just mentioned, but in particular the Electoral College, which is a sort of peculiarly American anomaly. So we want to take a look at that as well. And in particular also, then what are the implications of a system that's designed this way? We often talk about how elections have consequences, but it's also true that electoral processes have consequences as well. And there's some actually fairly famous cases in history where what you might describe as kind of a poorly designed electoral system produced some really ugly consequences. So we can think a little bit about that as well. So that's our mission for today, and I want to launch into that discussion. I want to also thank all of you forgive me for not mentioning earlier, all the students who are here from the various classes, and a lot of other people who are here under slightly less coercive circumstances. But some of my friends from outside of Hofstra, very kind of you to come, and some of my former students. So thank you all, and I hope this is an enlightening program for you. So I like to think of the American presidential election process as being best described as one that unfolds over 4 stages. And basically, these happen chronologically, but they're relatively distinct from each other. So let's, there are probably different ways you can conceptualize this, but this works pretty well for me. And I don't think there's too many different directions you could go with this. There's some kind of nuts and bolts you can't quite get around here. But let's begin this discussion by looking then at stage 1. And stage 1, can you see what's written between those parentheses there? It's a trick question. There's nothing. So I'm actually starting here with a pair of open parentheses. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to put a label on this, and I'm actually going to use a word primary, which I haven't even defined yet. In fact, I'm going to use it twice. But before I do that, I wanted to connote to you by the means of these open parentheses that this is a thing, but not really a thing. By which I mean, we use the word primary here as a kind of metaphor. Primaries are real things. Real primaries are very real things. And this is like a primary, but it's not an actual thing. But it has huge consequences. So we don't want to leave it off, but nor do we want to describe it as an actual sort of event or a thing in the same sense we would with primary. So I put those parentheses there. Another thing that's a little bit complicating here is that this thing goes by 2 basic terms I've heard fairly frequently. One is the invisible primary. Both of these terms really essentially refer to the same set of concepts. And that's one term, and you're certainly welcome to use that term, but there's a better term that I like because it really gets to the more specific thing that's happening here. It's basically a synonym, but maybe a more specific one. And that would be, instead of the invisible primary, the money primary. What we mean by either of these terms, both these terms, is simply the fact that you basically cannot hope to be president of the United States unless you have money from some source or another. It's more or less impossible. We may arrive at some point at the day where, because perhaps you're a celebrity and perhaps the media devotes enough attention to you, that you don't actually have to raise money, but we're not there yet. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, in the last presidential cycle, about $6.5 billion was spent on trying to be elected president in various different actors, various different candidates. So the money primary, the reason we call it a primary, primaries have the function ultimately of sifting out a broad field and reducing it down to a much smaller number of, generally speaking, you want. And we'll talk about that. That's going to be our next stage. So this has the same effect. It's not an actual event. There's no day on which this happens. There's no sort of event that you can point to. and this is why I put it in parentheses, it's not really a primary, but at the same time, if we left it out, we would be leaving out a very crucial and very consequential part of the process. Because again, if you don't have money, you're not going to be president. If you can't generate money from somewhere, you're not going to be able to run a campaign, you're not going to be able to do media, you're not going to be president. So the first concept here is the concept of the money primary, first stage, I should say. So when does this happen? Well, it kind of happens all throughout the process. Candidates are constantly raising money. But in particular, I think there's a lot of focus on that right about now. That would be the year before we begin the more official stages of the presidential election process. And it's really crucial, if you want to be viable, if you even want to stay in the race, to not necessarily win the money primary, but not lose the money primary. You have to generate enough funds to continue to be viable. So the money primary is really happening all the time, maybe right up to election day even, maybe for 2 years, possibly even more before that. The candidates are welcome to begin fundraising very early, and they do have to. We can put some real faces on this concept if you like. Here's a guy, if you went back almost exactly 4 years from this date, maybe a little bit earlier, and you asked me who's likely to win the Republican nomination in 2016. In other words, which of about, I think there were 17 Republican candidates seeking the nomination of their party would ultimately win the nomination and then go on and be able to contest for the presidency. This would have been somebody very high on my list for various reasons I can get into later if you're interested. Nobody in America in 2016 ever voted yes or no on Scott Walker. And the reason was he lost the money primary before the first real contest ever happened. So his name was never even on a ballot. There was no vote for him, yes or no, because he lost the money primary. Now, Walker had some maybe idiosyncratic issues. Apparently he was spending a lot of money. But that's still part of the same phenomenon. You have expenses, you need enough money to cover them. So here's a kind of poster child for this concept of the money primary. If you don't have money, even though you're very viable on paper, as Walker was, it's not going to work. You might know this guy. He was the first Democrat out of, I don't even know how many, maybe 25 people have been in. Maybe we're down to 20-ish or something now. I've lost track. But here's the first person to jump out, Congressman Eric Swalwell from California. And in fairness, I don't remember ever reading or hearing that he said, I'm dropping out because I don't have enough money. But it may very well be the case that somebody said to him, Eric, money's not coming in. Your campaign is not sustainable. Get out while you can still save face. So he jumped out very early. And I would not be surprised at all if money had a fair bit to do with that. And this one is quite interesting and quite timely. I don't know if you saw this news, but just within days of today, just recently, Cory Booker sent out an announcement to his supporters saying, if you don't send me $1.7 million in the next several days, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. Classic example, timely example of the money primary in action. So, yeah, his candidacy will die. He's telling his supporters that overtly if he doesn't have enough money. So you kind of have to get through this first stage. You kind of have to survive, I shouldn't say kind of, you have to survive the money primary. I say kind of because, again, it's not a real thing, but it really, really matters. So we don't want to discount it. So I kind of put it in parentheses. All right, this brings us to stage 2. Now we encounter real, actual primaries and an alternative method of doing the same thing that primaries do, which are known as caucuses. So let's start with thinking about the purpose of primaries and caucuses. Excuse me. The real reason is that you might want to do this is to create more actual choice in the presidential system. We really didn't have very much of this going on, if at all, before the 20th century. And then there was an early burst of it in the early part of the 20th century with the progressive movement, capital P, progressive. It was an actual movement. And then again in the late 60s, early 70s, when it really exploded again. And so you had more and more primaries and caucuses added to the system. Why do we want to do that? We want to do that because we want to create more choice. Let me give you an analogy. Suppose I invited you over to my house for breakfast, and suppose I wanted to be the perfect host, and I thought, I won't just offer you one thing to eat, I'll give you 2 things, and you can choose from either one, right? Because I want to be the perfect host. So you come over for breakfast, and here's what I put on the table. Would you like a nice bowl of liver loops, or perhaps instead a nice, lovely bowl of tripe Krispies, right? I don't know if you see my point here. And here's the idea. You have a choice, right? We cannot deny that I would be presenting you with a choice on paper. But as a matter of real choice, nobody wants either one of those things. So the analogy to politics is, imagine that in November of the election year, you have a choice between two candidates, but you had no input into the selection of those two candidates, and you really didn't like either one. Technically, you're still in democracy land, because technically you get to vote on who you want to be your president, and technically you have an actual choice, right? Tweedledee or Tweedledum. But it's, if you don't like either one and you had no means of affecting the choice of those two, you might argue that it's a kind of a hollow choice, a false choice. And in fact, a lot of people argue that. And this is what the progressive movement was saying in the beginning of the 20th century. They were saying, where do we get these party nominees who wind up on the ballot in November? And the answer is the proverbial smoke-filled room. You get a bunch of Democratic Party bosses, maybe 15 of them, maybe 10, some of whom are much more powerful than others, but they're sitting around in a smoke-filled room, probably, with a glass of scotch or something, and they're cutting deals. And part of that cutting of deals would entail selecting a nominee for the party. Here's our guy. This is the guy who's going to be our standard bearer in, 1888, what have you. And then the Republican bosses are doing the same thing. So the analogy here is, if you're a voter and come November, you get to choose between Democratic Party bosses selection A or Republican Party bosses selection B. By the way, if you want to think about this in sort of class terms, you don't have to, but there's maybe some value to doing that, especially in this period of time. Both of these are probably going to be folks who represent elites, not you as a kind of working stiff, your interests. So either way, you may look at the choices that you have and say, that's no choice at all. And so progressives in particular started saying we have to back this system up, introduce democracy into the system earlier. And that's why we began to see primaries and caucuses in the beginning part of the 20th century. After you get out of the experience of Vietnam and all the turmoil in the 1960s, and particularly shortly then again after Watergate, people are really clamoring for more democracy in the system. So you see this initial kind of secondary explosion of the advent of primaries and caucuses. In particular, I should mention, in 1968, the Democratic Party nominee, Hubert Humphrey, had entered precisely 0 primaries and precisely 0 caucuses. Nobody had ever voted yes or no on this man, and he became the nominee of that party for the presidency. So one of your two choices as a voter was somebody who nobody had ever been able to vote on prior to that moment. There were some peculiarities in 1968, not least of which Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in the middle of that campaign, but nevertheless, not a very democratic notion to many people's minds, and so hence the advent and then the sort of explosion subsequently of primaries and caucuses. So what is a primary? Well, in one sense, a primary is really easy to explain. It's simply an election where people in a given state who belong to a given party get to participate in the national choice of their party's nominee. Okay? I hope that sounded simple. It's sort of simple to my mind. Maybe I explained it in a way that makes it sound more elaborate than it is. But you basically, let's say there are 10 people who want to be the Democratic nominee, and you are a Democratic voter in Pennsylvania. You go on primary day, and you get to choose which of those 10 you like best, and multiply that across 50 states. And ultimately, from that process will emerge the people, the Democratic people's choice for a Democratic Party nominee. So it's actually quite simple. You literally, or it can be, you literally walk in, you are handed a ballot according to your party registration, you tick off a box, drop it in your box, go home, you're done. Okay? So that's a primary. As it'll turn out, and I'll describe this in a little bit, there are permutations on that. That's what we would call a classic, or more technically a closed primary. There are other alternatives, and I'll show you what those are in a second, but that's the classic model, and to my mind at least, it's the one that kind of makes sense intuitively and according to design to meet the concerns that I was mentioning before. After all, what's going on in that system that I just described? What's going on is the people who belong to a party, which after all, by the way, a party is a private organization. We could, in this room, form a political party and make our own rules, right? And we should be able, I would argue, to choose our own nominees, right? And that's what's going on in this closed primary system. Basically, individuals are able, who belong to a certain party, are able to participate in the choice of their party's nominee. But we'll see there's actually, over the years, other variations on a primary have developed, and so I mentioned those. These are, to my mind at least, less sensible and certainly less intuitive, but we'll come to that. Alternatively, the main alternative to a primary is a caucus. Not very many states do this, and if I'm not mistaken, about a half dozen of them that used to do it have decided in 2020 not to do it. So it's rather a kind of minority affair, but some states choose to do a caucus instead of a primary, and they basically have exactly the same function. That is, having your party in your state weighing in on who the nominee for that party should be. However, it's done differently. And where a primary is a very simple thing, you walk in, you tick off a box on the ballot, you drop it in, you go home. A caucus is a more elaborate affair. So what happens typically in a caucus, and every state will be different, every primary will be different, and every state, every caucus will be different. But typically what happens in a caucus is people will come aggregate in their locality. Maybe all the Democrats will gather in this part of town who want to participate in this will gather in the high school gymnasium. And maybe all the Republicans are over in the social hall of the church or what have you, right? And they're going to spend about 3 or 4 hours dialoguing with each other, talking about who amongst, let's say there are 10 candidates in their party, who amongst the people on that list are the best? Who should we pick? And they're going to sort of pull each other back and forth, try to get folks, voters in that area to come over to their side. And so this process of dialogue and debate and kind of rounds of voting unfolds over a period of 3 or 4 hours. And ultimately then each state that does a caucus will have a mathematical formula by which it sort of weights the winners and runners up, and then you aggregate that at the state level, and then you can say such and such state had a caucus today, and here are the results of that. It's a much more elaborate process. It requires people to really care enough about the system and about politics and government to invest a sizable chunk of their time. But you might argue it's a form of democracy that we like, in the sense that it brings people together and forces people to kind of really think through their choices and advocate for those choices and so forth. Anyhow, that's what a caucus is. Again, the point of a caucus is the same point of the primary. It's part of the process of choosing a party's nominee. So if we think about this system of, oh, yes, sir, please. Do you have a question?
What are the political advantages of a caucus that the states choose the caucus?
I don't know that there are political advantages. I don't know that, Iowa, for example, which is the most famous caucus in the country, has more political weight because it does a caucus as opposed to a primary. So I can't think of what the advantage is. I think what people are really thinking is this is a deliberative process. We like that rather than people just coming in, punching a clock. So I think that's probably what they're thinking when they decide to do a caucus. But if this year is any indication, this may be a dinosaur that's going extinct now. Maybe we won't have caucuses anymore in the future. Maybe even Iowa will flip to a primary. But you raise a good question. I don't have a good answer for you, though, in terms of the political benefits. Okay, so this process of choosing, as you'll see, I'll show you this month by month, this process of choosing your nominee for each of the parties ensues over basically the first half of election year, every 4 years. But there's a kind of rhythm to how election years work, and that rhythm is based on the fact that presidents can have, constitutionally, they're maxed out at 2 terms. They can actually have a little more under special circumstances, but basically, for every normal presidency, you can have a first term and you always will run for a second term. And very often you will get that, most often you will get that. And that gives us a kind of pair of cycles and maybe even a third cycle that kind of leapfrog each other over 8-year intervals. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Here's the first of those scenarios. And this is when you have no incumbent president running. So if I'm president, I get elected, 4 years later, I'm lucky enough to win re-election. 4 years after that, I can't run. I'm the incumbent, I cannot run. I'm timed out, tapped out by the Constitution. So in that case, you have no incumbent president running. And again, This will happen basically every 8 years. Again, there are circumstances that can disrupt this. A president can die in office, a president can resign, a president can be impeached or removed, a president cannot win a second term. But typically, you'll have this 8-year cycle going. And then there's another scenario, which is where an incumbent president is running and seeking a second term. And there's actually 2 of these scenarios, but let's start with the first one. And then you can see what I mean by leapfrogging. So on the interval years, every 4-year interval cycles, I should say, in between, you have another 8-year cycle going on. And these years are actual, right? In 2000, we had an incumbent president who was coming to the end of his second term, who could not run for office. And so that was one of those years. That's scenario number 1. In 2004, the president who had been elected in 2000 could run for re-election, did run for re-election, and that's an example of scenario number 2. But by 2008, then he became like the president in 2000. He couldn't run for election again. So we're back now to scenario number 1. Okay? I hope that makes sense. But let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Scenario number 1, this kind of 8-year cycle. You have no incumbent president running. Here's Bill Clinton. He was ending his tenure in office, his second term in office in 2000. And what you then get, and this slide is actually going to be the key slide that illustrates how the primary and caucus process works. But right now what I want to show you is what happens in these 8-year cycles. Because Clinton was a Democrat, because he cannot run, Democrats don't hesitate in 2000 to run themselves, right? They're not running, they wouldn't be running against an incumbent president. All the doors are knocked down, they go for it. Republicans, of course, they don't have any reason not to run, so in fact they do. So this is basically what you're doing when you do these series of primaries and caucuses. You have a bunch of nominees. Right now we have about 20-some Democrats. The whole point of this second stage that we're talking about, the primary and caucus stage, is to get that down to 1 nominee. And similarly, Republicans, okay, 1 nominee. So in this first 8-year cycle, when you have no incumbent president running, you would see something like this on both sides, okay? But then you have this other scenario where you have an incumbent president who is now seeking a second term. Here's an example of that, Obama. And I should mention, relatively popular. That'll become relevant in a second. Obama was relatively popular. He was, most importantly, quite popular with Democrats, who were the ones who decide who the Democratic nominee will be. And so in 2012, he was seeking a second term, and this is that second sort of arc in the leapfrog that we were getting. In this scenario, the Republican field would be wide open. If I'm thinking I've got that presidential stuff, there's no reason for me not to run if I'm a Republican. On the other hand, if I'm a Democrat and I think I could be president, there's a really big reason for me not to run, which is that my party is already in the White House and my party's president is going to be seeking a second term. And all I can really do is probably damage this popular president from my own party. My party's going to hammer me if I do this, and I'm also going to lose. So I have really good reasons not to do it. And generally speaking, if it is a popular president, they will run unopposed in the primary. They will get their party's nomination without opposition, whereas the opposite party, you'll have a bunch of candidates fighting for nomination. And that's what you see there. There's a third scenario, which is similar to the second one, but a little bit different, where you have an unpopular incumbent president. Okay? Here's an example of such a person. Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 for reasons that were partly, I would say, his own doing and partly not. By 1980, he was not a very popular figure and not necessarily even very popular amongst Democrats, which was his party. So he sought a second term. Pretty much every president does. It's almost an admission of failure if you can't get a second term, so nobody sort of doesn't try. Carter sought a second term, but because he was weak and perceived, the perception was of blood in the water, you had an incentive for other Democrats to challenge him for the nomination of their mutual party. You don't normally see that, but the time where you will see that is when the president is sort of weak and other Democrats think, not only am I the guy who should be president, but also they'll make the argument, our party would be stronger without the incumbent president. He's weak, he's a loser, pick me instead. So famously in 1980, Teddy Kennedy challenged Carter for the nomination. Kennedy also obviously has the name, and he did quite well, but he didn't win. So what happened in that case, and what typically happens is that the incumbent president gets the nomination, but they get pretty roughed up along the way. This is exactly why people are discouraged from challenging an incumbent president, because it hurts your party. And so as we go further in this process, as we get to stage 3 and 4, they're going to be carrying some damage and some baggage, and they're going to have expended resources in order to get the nomination that arguably they should never have had to expend because they're already the incumbent president of their party. But sometimes people smell blood in the water, and so they'll go for it, right? And so you have this situation in 1980. What almost always happens, I don't think there's at least in the modern era, I don't think there's an exception to this. The incumbent party president wins the nomination, but then loses the general election, does not get a second term. Now, is that because they got roughed up? Whoops. They got roughed up by their challenger. How about that one? Yeah. Is that because they got roughed up by their challenger? In the primary process? It could be, but more likely it's because they were actually not so strong to begin with. Okay. So here's a variation of this third scenario where you have an unpopular incumbent. This guy is a little different because nationally, he's really unpopular. I mean, he's sort of been breaking records for a first-term president in job approval. But within his party, he's beloved. I mean, Republicans adore Trump to the tune of about 85, 90% poll data. So where Carter was, I think a lot of Democrats didn't like Carter, or people from his own party, that is not true for Trump. Nevertheless, Trump is, nationally speaking, an unpopular incumbent coming up on the opportunity to seek a second term. And so what you now have, in fact, is not even a theoretical proposition, but at least 3 Republicans have entered the race to challenge Trump. Just as a side note, we don't know who will win that, but we sort of do. And I say that even though the president of the United States appears, as of 2 days ago, to be on the road to being impeached. I still think it's borderline crazy to imagine that he won't get the nomination of his party for the reason that I gave. People in the Republican Party base love him. So you have these kind of not terribly well-known figures who are challenging him. I think the odds of them prevailing are not very great at all, but they can and they will. The other thing that's a little bit unique about this is that the Republican Party, no doubt under the direction of the Trump campaign, has literally been canceling primaries. So these 3 folks who are challenging Trump, in some states, voters won't even get the chance to vote for them because Trump has said, cancel your primary, and therefore he will become the nominee, he will get the delegates to become the nominee voted for from that state. So, this is pretty clearly, I think, undoing the democratic process, but that's a whole other story. But this is what you're looking at here, a little bit of a permutation on this third scenario. Okay, so I mentioned before that this primary calendar sort of ensues over the first several months, first half year really of election year. And let's take a look at how that works. February could be earlier than that. It's definitely been in January. It could even back up into December of the previous year. But you have the first contests right around January, February. They start always in Iowa, and then they go next to New Hampshire. Why always? This is literally true. The legislatures in those 2 states have passed laws saying that no state can come before us. And so if some state comes along and says, oh, why don't we schedule ours a week before Iowa, then Iowa will just reschedule theirs a week before theirs. It's just never going to happen, at least in our lifetime. So the first event is the Iowa caucuses. And because it's the first event, and New Hampshire, I would say the same thing, it's the second event that happens a week later, it has way out of proportion consequence. These are relatively small states. They're relatively unrepresentative states, which is a criticism people have of the system. But if you win the first 2 events, you're really on the road to capturing the nomination of your party. And if you lose the first 2 events, especially if expectations for you were high, and then you didn't fulfill those expectations, you're probably very well along the way to not winning the nomination of your party, even though people thought you would a week ago. So they have outsized importance simply by virtue of the calendar, and that's why their legislatures pass those laws. They want to keep that outsized importance, and they get that by being first. So Iowa does a caucus, New Hampshire does a primary, then you go to caucuses in Nevada, and then a primary in South Carolina. Those are the first 4. It's quite possible that we'll have a pretty good idea on the Democratic side who the nominee will be, maybe even after the first two, but maybe even after the first four. It's by no means a done deal, but I would say far more election cycles, you kind of know relatively early on rather than having to wait another couple months for a whole bunch more contests to occur. Anyhow, this is where we begin. And then in March, you can see a whole bunch of states jump in. And in particular, March 3rd is what we call Super Tuesday, meaning that a whole bunch of states are going to hold their primaries and caucuses on the same day. So a whole huge number of delegates will be determined. Delegates are what you count in order to determine who gets the nomination of the respective parties. If California alone held a primary, you could almost call that a Super Tuesday alone. Same, little bit less so with Texas, but both of those states are March 3rd, and then maybe about a dozen other states. So a gigantic proportion of the delegates will be decided. And it's very likely, it seems to me, that at this point, you surely would know who the nominee will be of the Democratic Party, even though, of course, it's not official yet. So that's March. And then you can see, as we get into April and May and June, it's almost kind of a mopping up operation. These could be extremely consequential elections if you have a very tight race. These could be the kingmakers, but that's pretty rare. Usually the decision is pretty evident quite early on, maybe even after Iowa and New Hampshire. Okay, so what are they fighting for across all these primaries and caucuses? The ultimate objective, as I said, is to winnow the respective fields down to one each, and that person then is the party nominee, or the Democrats and the Republicans. I should mention that there are other parties in America. There's the Green Party, there's the Libertarian Party, there's all kinds of parties. But let's be honest, in our time here, and for quite a long time in the historical record, only these two parties really matter. Only these two parties have a chance of winning the presidency. That could change, but it's not on the horizon right now. So I'll just talk about those two parties. So the idea then is to choose the nominee. Here's where you do it officially at the convention, and you can see the dates and the locations for the two conventions coming up in summer of 2020. Usually they're a little closer together, but that's when the nominees will be officially chosen. Now, mathematically, we pretty much already know. I mean, it's very rare. I think the last time that this wasn't true maybe was the 1950s. But we pretty much know coming into the conventions who's going to win the nomination. There's really no mystery to that. And so you have these conventions where they're almost a coronation of the person who won the second stage of the process, the primaries and caucuses. Here's a kind of picture of a classic convention. These conventions used to be a pretty big deal. There was a lot going on. There would be fights over the platform. There might be even fights over who would get the nomination. There would be all kinds of fights over rules, all kinds of stuff like that. There was a lot of suspense, genuine, sort of question about what would happen at these conventions, and they would get wall-to-wall media coverage over a space of maybe 4 days, right? And this is kind of what that old scenario looked like. But today, the media doesn't even bother really to cover these very much, and the main reason for that is there's not very many mysteries left. One important mystery remains, and that is, who is the person who gets the nomination going to choose as their running mate, their vice presidential running mate? So one example of that mystery sort of exploding across everybody's horizon was this choice, Sarah Palin. And everybody was like, Sarah who? Right? The governor of Alaska, right? How many people in this room could name the governor of Alaska today? I can't. I'm a political scientist. I have no idea who that is. And that's who Sarah Palin was. So that was a big mystery and a big surprise. Sometimes you have a little bit of a sense of who that person might be, but this one was a bit of a shocker. And that's really, I think, the only mystery that really is left to unfold at conventions these days. Okay. Let me circle back for a second to talk about primaries. I had mentioned that there are different types of primaries, and in fact, there are basically 3 models, and lots of permutations. The classic model that I described before is a closed primary. So basically, if I'm a registered Democrat, I show up at my polling place on primary election day, and they hand me the Democratic ballot, and only the Democratic ballot, and on that are a list of Democratic candidates for the president, and only Democratic candidates for the president. And I choose one, drop it in the box, and go home. If I'm a Republican, I get the Republican ballot, same deal, drop it, go home. Okay? that's a closed primary. To my mind, again, nobody ever asked me, but I'll tell you my thoughts on this. This is kind of what makes sense. This is the notion of parties being able, members of parties, registered voters of parties, being able to choose who they want to be their standard bearer, which seems to, again, to my mind, to sort of make sense. But here's another con, an open primary. So in an open primary, I'm a registered anything. I go and I show up to vote, and then they ask me, hey, which ballot do you want? You can't have all of them, but you can have one, and you can have anyone you want. So I can be a registered Democrat and ask for the Republican ballot, and I will get the ballot with all the Republicans on it, none of the Democrats. That's an open primary. And one of the interesting things about an open primary is it can lead to a fair bit of political mischief. Because think about it, suppose you're a registered Republican in 2020 and there's a primary in your state. Would you take the Republican ballot? Well, maybe, but if you're maybe a little bit cynical and a little bit interested in winning, you might instead ask for the Democratic ballot and find the biggest sort of bozo on that list and go for that person, because that's the person you want to go up against your nominee, Donald Trump. Right? So you can get into sort of mischievous, sort of strategic voting, which is okay, but that's only possible if you have an open primary. Then, finally, there's this kind, which is a very, very strange animal. And the only state I know of that does this, and it may not even still be doing it, is California. I could be wrong, there could be others, and they may not. I think there was a court case on this, and I'm not sure how that landed. But on a blanket primary, in a blanket primary system, you get a ballot, everybody gets a ballot, and every candidate from every party is on that ballot. And then you pick the one that you like best. So all the Republicans are listed, all the Democrats, all the Green Party, if there's more than one, Libertarian, all the rest. You pick the one that you like best. And then the top two vote getters in that primary go on to our next stage, the general election, and they appear on the ballot again. So two things about that. One is it's really kind of a runoff system. It's really what's going on. If you're familiar at all with how the French elect their president, it's quite similar to this. Anybody who wants to be on the first ballot is on the first ballot. Top two vote getters go on to the second ballot, and then voters have to pick between these two. The other thing about this that's sort of interesting is, imagine you do this in a very blue state or a very red state. It quite likely could occur and does occur that the two choices that you get in November are both Democrats. So voters then do not have a choice between a Democrat and a Republican because it's a very blue state. The number one choice is obviously going to be a Democrat, but the number two choice is going to be a Democrat, or vice versa. It's a very red state. So that's a blanket primary. It's pretty rare. It's pretty weird, I think, but it's out there. Okay, so that's stage two. We went through then the process of choosing our nominees through primaries and caucuses, and that brings us to stage three, which is the general election. Here's what the Constitution says about the general election, that Congress may choose the date on which this occurs, and Congress has done so. It is the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. Why? Don't ask me. That's a pretty weird thing. And people have criticized this for at least two reasons. One is November is not necessarily a good weather month, right? And weather affects elections. So if we really believe in people participating in democracy, shouldn't we do this in like June? And then the other thing is people have to work. So a lot of people can't take time off on a Tuesday. Why don't we do this on a Sunday? Anyhow, that's not the current plan. So we do this on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. And in 2020, that means our election will be held on November 3rd. Now here's where stage three gets a little bit strange and, again, a little counterintuitive. What you probably perceive, what most people perceive as happening on election day in November of election year, is a single country voting for its president. In a way, that's true, but technically, I think I would encourage you to think of it rather differently. In fact, what I think is really going on is 50 states plus the District of Columbia, 51, I'll just use the word state, simultaneously holding a separate election for the national office of President of the United States. It isn't really a single national election, and hopefully as we work through stage three and stage four, you'll see what I mean by that. But conceptually, I think you're much better off to understand it as 51 simultaneous state-contained state elections happening simultaneously at the same time. So let me try to illustrate this with a hypothetical scenario. Suppose we had an election and 100 million people voted nationally. And suppose California voted in that election and 20 million voters showed up to vote in California. These numbers actually are not hugely far from reality, but anyhow, this is just a hypothetical. Now, imagine two different scenarios in California unfolding. In the first scenario, 20 million votes are split almost exactly evenly, with one more vote for the Democrat. In the second scenario, we could make this actually 20 million to 0, but almost 20 million people vote for the Democrat and only one person votes for the Republican. Okay? Two very, very different scenarios, I think you would agree. The swing between the two scenarios in the national vote would be 20 million votes, or 1/5 of the total. That's a huge chunk. But, and this is where I'm trying to illustrate this point, that you're actually looking at 50 separate simultaneous elections. There's no difference in California's impact on the national election from scenario 1 to scenario 2. Nor does California have any effect on any other state, regardless of which of those two scenarios unfolds. And nor would there be any effect, whether you have scenario 1 or scenario 2, on who would ultimately become the president of the United States. The reason for that, you'll see as we work through stage 3 and stage 4. But again, I think conceptually the best way to think about this, and hopefully this kind of illustrates this concept, is these are separate elections. They just happen to be going on simultaneously, and then we aggregate them to choose a national leader. But it's not like there's a single national election that's actually happening. It just happens to be at the same time. Here's another thing that is a little bit of an oddity, which I think we should understand. When you get your ballot to vote, this will be in November 3rd, right, 2020 in this case, you'll probably see two names, maybe Donald Trump and Elizabeth Sanders. Elizabeth Warren. Put those two together. So you're thinking that you're voting for one of those two candidates, and sort of you are, but in reality, you're not. In reality, what you're voting for behind them, kind of behind the scenes, if you will, are two different slates of what are called electors. So your vote is actually being cast for a group of people who are pledged to vote each respectively for those two candidates. You're choosing their name on the ballot, but in reality, what you're electing is a group of people we call electors. And because they're a group, we call it a slate. So you're actually voting between slate 1 and slate 2, Democratic slate and Republican slate. Those electors then coming from each state are the ones who will actually determine the outcome of the election, and that brings us basically then to stage 4. Before I go there, I just want to stop for a second and reassess and backtrack a little bit and talk about the implications of the last two stages we talked about. Stage 2 with the primaries and caucuses, and stage 3 with the general election. And they have some implications. Remember I said at the beginning, depending on how you construct your electoral system, you can produce different outcomes, and some of them might be quite unintended. So let's look at kind of two models that have emerged over time for how you might want to play out this scenario, which compels candidates to do certain things because of the nature of the way it's structured. Here's one scenario, which I'm going to call the traditional model. Basically, to my knowledge, this was the way candidates sought the presidency until you get to 2004. And that is basically this. If I'm a Democrat, the people who are going to choose me or not choose me to be the nominee of the party, right, that's stage number 2, basically, are going to be Democrats. And they're going to be left, ideologically speaking, left of center. So if I want to win the nomination, and if I don't win the nomination, I'm done. So I got to win the nomination. If I want to win the nomination, I'm going to tack to the left because I have to appeal to a relatively more contained, relatively more liberal primary voting base. Same with the Republican mirror image. Those people are going to be more conservative. That candidate's got to tack to the right in order to capture the nomination. Then I have to, for the general election, sort of tiptoe back to the center, probably fairly awkwardly, because now what I'm trying to do is appeal to a broader electorate. The people who vote in the general election are not just Democrats, it's everybody. So I can assume Democrats are probably going to vote for me if I'm the Democratic nominee, and I can assume most Republicans are probably going to vote for the Republican nominee, but what I'm interested in doing then under this classic standard model is getting these people in the middle. Okay, so that's where the race is won in the general election. So to win the nomination of my party, I have to tack to the outside to win the general election where everybody votes, I've got to appeal to everybody, I better get back close to the middle. And like I said, you see candidates do it, and it's not often a pretty picture. Because they're sort of saying one thing here, and then 4 months later they're saying something rather different. They try to nuance it, but still you've got a problem there. Okay, well that's the first approach. There's a second approach, and the guy you see on the screen here, I think, is really embodying this in his presidency and the way he's running for re-election. But it goes back to my knowledge, maybe there's an antecedent for this, but to my knowledge, it goes back to 2004. So go back even further to 2000. We had a very controversial election. I'm not going to get into that, but George W. Bush became president of the United States. And I think it's fair to say that he ran that first traditional model that we just talked about. The Bush family and Bush himself as a candidate, and Bush himself before that he was governor of Texas, all sort of came out of the kind of centrist model of Republican politics, sort of moderate, center-right. And he ran as a compassionate conservative, which is a code word for I'm not a hard-right conservative, right? So he runs, and we have this very controversial election. He emerges, he becomes president. Karl Rove, who was his consigliere, his political guru and statistician and what have you, comes to Bush after the election and says, you know that middle that we've been fighting over for all these cycles in the standard election model? That middle is disappearing. Our country is polarizing ideologically in terms of partisanship. So we're not going to win by trying to be a wishy-washy center moderate Republican in 2004. The way we're going to win is go to the right in the primary election and stay there in the general election. And here's what you then have to do. The winner will be the one who can get the greater number of people on their side to turn out. So you don't win by capturing the middle. You win by boosting turnout for your base. And Bush did that. So the guy who ran, the guy from a moderate conservative family, who was a moderate conservative governor of Texas, who ran a moderate conservative campaign, governed as a pretty hard right, very hard right conservative president, and ran as a hard right candidate in 2004, and it worked, and he won. So as I said, Donald Trump is really sort of embodying this very much now. He's not, if you look at Donald Trump, the one thing everybody I think can agree on is that he's made absolutely zero effort to try to broaden his base. He's really trying to tune up his own supporters and get them excited and get them willing to come out and vote for him. So he's betting on this second model of how you win the presidency. Okay, this was just a little side note on kind of the implications of having those two stages, the primary stage, which compels you one way, and then the general election, which sort of compels you another way. Now we can come back to our four-stage model. And this brings us finally to the fourth stage. Here we come to the Electoral College. And here the Constitution also speaks to this. It says each state shall appoint in the manner that they choose, that's an important clause, a number of electors, and we'll come to the formula in a second for how they do that. So it also says that Congress may choose a certain day on which those electors will cast their votes, and Congress has decided that will happen on the Monday following the second Wednesday in December. Again, it's a mystery to me, but that's what Congress came up with, and that's what we do. So what was the intent that the founders had in mind when they created the Electoral College? Well, look at these guys, they don't seem to know. I mean, it's sort of a mysterious institution. But I think there's some clarity as to what the founders had in mind. I think the founders, and bless their hearts, I think we tend to revere the founders a little bit too much and without exactly thinking about why. But one thing the founders did, and maybe we don't revere them enough for this, is they launched an extremely bold, in their time, experiment in democracy. They did something that really had not been done before. They wouldn't have used the word democracy, but they launched this experiment. But at the same time, I think they were very nervous about this, and so they hedged their bets a little bit. So fundamentally, I think what the founders had in mind with the Electoral College was, okay, we'll let the people vote, and then if the people go crazy and do something we don't like, we'll interpose between the voters and the presidency this other institution of sort of wise men who can cool down the choice of the people, right? So if the people all vote for Karl Marx, who's talking about confiscating the property of the rich, we're going to have this Electoral College where we can step in and choose Adam Smith instead, who's not going to do that. I think that was their original intent. But what the Electoral College actually does today is rather different from that. It's sort of a mechanical device, by and large today, which reflects the way the popular vote ensues in each of the 51 states. So you actually don't have wise men who sort of sit around the table and decide, how should we vote? Should we vote the way, should we choose a president that the voters chose, or should we choose somebody else? It really doesn't work that way, and I don't think it ever did work that way originally. Okay, so let's ask a couple questions and see if we can answer them about the Electoral College. How are electoral votes apportioned? As I mentioned before, that's in the Constitution. And the formula is you get the number of electoral votes that's equal to the number of senators from your state, which is always 2, and the number of representatives from your state, which is roughly proportionate to population. So here's an example. California. It's got 2 senators, like every state does. It's so large in population that it's got 53 representatives. If you add those 2 figures together, you get 55 electors for California. How are electors awarded to candidates after the election? Well, the short answer is winner take all. In every state except for 2, if I'm a candidate and I win the popular vote in my state, again, California, if I win 1 more vote out of 20 million and some other candidate wins 1 less, I get all 55 electors and that other person gets 0. In 48 of the states, it's winner take all. 2 states do something differently. They're both really small states, so it's not very consequential. But Nebraska and Maine use, it's not even a proportionate system. You might be tempted to think that it's a proportionate system, so you translate the proportion of the popular vote into a similar proportion of the electoral vote. It's not. They basically award 1 elector according to the outcome in each of their congressional districts, and then 2 electors according to the state outcome of the race. There you go. Okay, next question about the Electoral College. How do electors vote? Almost always, they do what they pledge to do. Remember, who are the electors? They come from these slates. So if I'm on the Elizabeth Warren slate in New York, I've been elected to the Electoral College. If she wins New York, I'm pledged to vote for her. When I go to the Electoral College, which I don't physically actually do, this happens in each state. There is no college, there is no even meeting of these people, but they cast their ballot. When I go to the Electoral College and cast my vote, almost always, I will vote as I pledge to vote. However, I don't have to. And we have this phenomenon which is known as a faithless elector. Somebody who pledged to vote for candidate X, but ultimately votes for candidate Y, or more likely actually candidate Z, somebody who wasn't the nominee of either of the 2 parties as a kind of protest vote. This happens really rarely, and it has never, to my knowledge, swung the outcome of an election at all. So it's just something interesting to know about, and it points to something interesting about the Electoral College, which is even though I'm pledged to vote a certain way, I don't have to. That's the whole point of having this body interposed between the voters and the presidency. They have the freedom to do what they want. They just rarely ever exercise that freedom. Okay, so finally now we can figure out how presidents are actually elected in the United States system. The short answer to that question is you have to win a majority of the Electoral College. There are 538 electors in the Electoral College, so the short answer is the person who will be the next president is the person who wins 270 electors out of 538 in the Electoral College. Are there problems with this system? I think a lot, actually, and a lot of other people do as well. This is kind of the singularly most attempted amendment that's been made to the Constitution, but all those amendments have failed. I'll come back to that. And the reason that's the case is because a lot of people don't like it, and I would say for good reason. So let me share with you what I think are 4 problems with this system, and then we'll actually add a 5th. One, it's confusing to voters. I think a lot of voters don't really get, well, I cast my ballot, but my ballot doesn't really count. Why do we have this other thing? How does it work? So by and large, I mean, that's not maybe the most horrible thing in the world, but I would say a democracy that people understand is better than a democracy that people don't understand. That's the first problem. Second problem is it exaggerates winning proportions. Again, I don't want to overstate this. This is sort of a psychological phenomenon, and generally speaking, it's not a big deal. But look at how this works. In 1984, we had an election. You probably recognize the guy on the left. You probably don't recognize the guy on the right because he lost the election. But Ronald Reagan was running for a 2nd term, and he was quite popular at the time. So we had an election, and as in all elections, you had a popular vote and an electoral vote. Reagan won 59%, Mondale won 49%. So that may not strike you as a blowout, right? But actually in presidential elections, that is a blowout. That's one of the most lopsided elections in American history. That's a gigantic proportion that Reagan won. However, having said that, Walter Mondale won more than 2 out of 5 votes in America. More than 2 out of 5 people in America said, I want that guy to be my president. So how did that national popular vote distribution play out in terms of the electoral vote? Mondale's 2/5 of the electorate bought him close to 2% of the electoral vote. This is an example of what I'm talking about. The electoral vote almost always massively exaggerates the national popular vote. Here's another more normal example. In 2012, you have these two guys running against each other. This was a much closer election, much more typical election. Obama won 51-47. That's a more normal spread. I would not say it's a really slight spread, but nor would I say it's a really big spread. It's kind of normal these days. What does that mean in terms of the electoral vote? It means Obama gets 62% and Romney's 47% is about 10 points less in the electoral. Does this matter? In both these cases, the person who won the popular vote became the president of the United States. So I don't really have a problem with this, except that it kind of psychologically it sort of exaggerates the degree of victory in almost every election. And you might have certain individuals, I won't name names, who sort of brag about the size of their electoral victory, and they can point to these numbers, and they're deceptive in that sense. So that's a second problem that I would mention. A third problem is that technically, this doesn't happen, but technically the design of the founders was to allow the electors to do what they want. So we could have an election where somebody wins and the electors in the Electoral College simply decide, nah, we don't like that person. We want this other person. And they have the power and the capacity according to the Constitution to do that. If you value democracy, and if you believe that democracy has certain basic rules, like the people get to choose who their leaders are, I would say that this is problematic because this is a profoundly non-democratic idea, a small d, non-democratic idea. And here's what that would look like. The voters pick that person, but the Electoral College says, no, we want this other person instead. Here's where I think the Electoral College really gets problematic, the fourth problem. The voters don't always get the president that they elected. These three guys did not win the popular vote, but they became president. And these two people, much more recently, same deal, did not win the popular vote. In Trump's case, by a fairly wide margin of almost 3 million votes, still became president. And one other thing you should pick up on here is look at the dates of those two elections. Half of the elections in this century, half of the last 4 elections, have gone to the person who lost the popular vote. To my mind, at least, you certainly should feel free to differ, but to my mind, that's a dysfunctional system sort of breaking down and not really doing democracy if you believe in the basic tenets of democracy. And why does that happen? It happens because of that winner-take-all notion and the notion that you have 51 separate elections going on. So somebody can win state by state by state by 1 vote, but that translates into all the electoral votes. And so you can get sort of different permutations where you can quite readily, 5 times in American history this has happened, win the popular vote but not win the president. Okay, why did the founders do this? I gave you one reason I think earlier, the first reason. You hear this word actually, mob. They feared the mob. They feared the kind of, unthinking, unkempt, wild people who might even be drunk on cider and who might demand some sort of government or politics or hang somebody from the nearest tree. They were a little bit fearful, maybe even a lot fearful of the mob. So as I mentioned, they did democracy, but they hedged. And they created this electoral college. This is one of the reasons. And you see, basically, I've seen 3 reasons in the historical record. So I'll give you those 3. That's one. A second one is this. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the 3/5 notion in the constitutional compromise. So what happens, remember how we get the number of electors per state? It's a formula that's based on your 2 senators plus how many representatives you have. Well, representatives are based on population. Slave states got to count 3/5 of their slaves as part of the population, even though, of course, those people weren't voting. So that favored the slave states. And it's important to understand at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, this was a real stumbling block. How could you create a union where all the 13 former colonies would want to be part of that and actually give up some of their power to be part of that? And the slave states, I think, in particular, were worried that the other states would try to end slavery. So they got some additional voting power because of this. And on a similar concept, small states were very fearful of big states. And this is, and I think this is an important point that's largely lost to history, but you should really understand that the 13 former colonies at the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 really saw themselves as 13 countries. And what the Constitution fundamentally does is brings them together in a single country, creates a governing national government above them, and requires them to give up some of their sovereignty. That's a word for power, basically. Give up some of their power to that national government. That's a hard sell, right? If I said to you, how about if we join a new country? America joins a new country called the Western Hemisphere country, okay? And we have to give up some of our power, some of our sovereignty, some of our autonomy in order to do that. You might see the merits of doing that, you might see some benefits, but you would also be really worried about the fact that this new government was going to dictate things to us that we wouldn't want to have dictated to. This was fundamentally the problem that the founders were dealing with and almost broke apart the convention. The small states were really worried about being dominated by the big states. And so the convention threw some bones to the small states, not least of which is every state has 2 senators regardless of population. But you also see that going on here. And I'll show you some examples of this, how the math translates. Small states do much better in the Electoral College as a general rule. Wyoming is our least populous state. It has 578,000 people. As our least populous state, it gets 3 electors, right? 2 senators equivalent, 1 representative equivalent. Not the senators and representative, but the numbers, okay? If you do the division there, you get 193,000 people per electoral vote. Compare that to California. It's got 55 electors. It's got 40 million people, 725,000 people per electoral vote. Look at that. In other words, what's going on, to bring it right down to brass tacks, is if I live in Wyoming, I have essentially 4 times, almost 4 times the political voting power of somebody who lives in California. And you basically see this up and down on the list of 50 states. The smaller you are, generally speaking, there's a little bit of permutations here and there, but generally speaking, the smaller you are, the more voting power you have per individual. And that, by the way, is sort of my 5th complaint about the Electoral College. If you want what arguably might even be a more graphic representation of this problem, here are the 23 least populous states. Start with Wyoming in the bottom and start working up to the top. 23 states equal California in population. 40 million people in California, 40 million people in the least populous states, 23 of them. Look at the Electoral College representation. 55 in California, almost double the number in those 23 states. So a lot more real estate, right? But do we really want to do vote proportionate to dirt clods, or do we really want to do vote proportionate to human beings? This is a 5th problem with the Electoral College system. But again, this was a way to entice small states by throwing them some extra power. What can you do about this, assuming you agree that this is problematic? As I mentioned, the obvious answer to that question would be to amend the Constitution and simply get rid of the Electoral College. The problem with that is, for obvious reasons of power, try to convince 38 states to ratify that amendment, including a whole lot of small states who have nothing to lose but their power. It's not going to happen. And as I said, no other subject of the Constitution has been subjected to attempted amendments more than this. It never works. Okay? So that's not going to happen. But some people came up with what I think is a really clever idea, which essentially constitutes a workaround to this provision in the Constitution. And this is known as the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The way it works is this. States join this compact. It's a deal. They pledge when they join this compact that they will give in every election their electors will vote for the winner of the national popular vote, not the winner of their state. Okay, so think about that for a second. The winner of the national popular vote, not the winner of their state. Let me illustrate. New York almost always going to vote Democratic, right? If a Republican wins the national vote, even though the Democratic nominee almost assuredly won New York, nevertheless, New York is going to vote for the Republican. Okay? Similarly, Mississippi, pretty red state, right? But if a Democrat wins the national popular vote and Mississippi were to become part of this compact, it would say that we're not going to pay attention to the vote in Mississippi. We're going to pay attention to the national popular vote, and they would vote for the Democrat. Right now, the states in green have all signed on to this compact, and the states in yellow are considering legislation to also sign on to this compact. This is what they look like according to their electoral vote proportions. And this is what they total. Remember, you need 270 in order to win. You've got 196 states worth of electors already pledged to this compact. As I mentioned, you need 270 to get there. And we've got 108 electors worth of states, I guess I should say, who are now considering this legislation and add themselves to the list. You obviously don't need 108 worth of states. You need enough just to pass that 270 threshold. If you do that, then you will have effectively bypassed the Electoral College because enough states equaling 270 are saying, we're not going to pay attention to what happened in our state. We're going to pay attention to the national popular vote, and our votes will be 270 or more. And therefore, you'll never have the problems that I mentioned with the Electoral College going in the future, and you don't have to amend the Constitution to get there. So we'll see. Obviously, this is an idea that has some traction. Whether it can get over the line or not is one question. Another question is, what will the courts do with this? Because almost assuredly, this will be challenged in the court. But remember that line from the Constitution I asked you to remember, where it said the states will choose their electors in the manner of their own desire. I think if you really care about really being honest about the Constitution and its provisions and the history, right? Remember, we have two states who don't use winner-take-all. That obviously implies states can do what they want. You would have a hard time, I think, ruling this as an unconstitutional notion. Stranger things have happened in my lifetime. Anyhow, let me conclude then, and I'll be glad. I'm sorry I went on as long as I did, but I'm glad to take any questions or comments. You have basically these 4 stages from beginning to end to get to the presidency. One last point, if you lop off the 4th stage, you can basically apply the first 3 stages of this model to many other offices that we elect in the United States, particularly at the state level, but also at the national level. So senators, representatives, governors, lieutenant governors, secretaries of state, attorneys general. Basically, it's the same model, except you don't have an electoral college. So I'll stop there, and I'd be glad to take your comments or questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I've been asked to insist that you use a microphone if you want to ask a question. We need to get the sound on that. Hang on one second. Are there students who have questions? And maybe I'll go to. Can we use this one up front?
Yeah.
Check that. I guess if you want to ask a question, please queue up at the mic. So we'll just take people. Starting with this young lady.
If I'm voting as a Democrat, and it's the primary, and there are 3 or 4 candidates that I have a choice of, let's say I choose Elizabeth Warren, why don't I also have a right to vote in the primary for Republican if there are 3 or 4 choices? Because I still should want to have somebody that I would prefer as a Republican in case he or she wins the election.
I think the premise is that, as I mentioned before, parties are privately constituted organizations. We could form a party here. Imagine that we did. Would you be comfortable with other people telling us what our rules should be and who our nominees should be? You probably wouldn't, I would think. So the idea is the people who should choose the nominee of a party should be the people in that party and only those people. And if you subscribe to that notion, which I do, by the way, I think that makes sense, then you would only get to vote for, in the primaries, you would only get to vote for one party or the other.
Professor, thank you very much for a very illuminating lecture, because I voted in every election since Eisenhower ran. 1960, I think. He ran against, I don't know who he ran against, but he was very popular at the time. What you didn't speak about is the integrity of the election system and the cyber attacks that are maybe prevalent to change the outcome of votes and also disrupt and confuse the election system. And I've been reading a lot about that. And that is a major problem for many counties in America that have, results that could be cyber attacked or cyber changed.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Eisenhower, by the way, ran against Adlai Stevenson twice, a long time ago, before I was born. You raise an absolutely great question, and frankly, if I'm being totally honest with you guys, I would say that our election system is under attack domestically and internationally. So obviously the Russians have tried to do that. There's some belief that the Iranians and the Chinese either are doing that or will do that. And unfortunately, our Congress, under the direction of Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate, refuses to take any steps to legislate, although I guess McConnell has now opened the door a little bit on that, but up to just recently he was refusing to do anything about that. Then I would also point to when I think there are a series of really unfortunate aspects of the choices that we make domestically about how we do elections, including voter suppression laws or laws that have the effect of voter suppression, radical gerrymandering, and a whole series of things along those lines that people who don't have an adequate number of polling stations, refusal to have paper ballots, refusal to find a way to guarantee the integrity of electronic voting machines. And so it's all very distressing, I would say. If you're concerned about that, I absolutely join you in that sense. And I think that's a bomb that is waiting to explode, and the consequences could be really dire. I mean, if you remember 2000, there was sort of near violence in a few places. And if you think about the different America that we live in just 19 years later, I don't think I would be exaggerating too much to say that some kind of deeply contested election could result in a real polarization of the country and maybe even something worse than that. So I have deep concern about that. I wish our government was serious about dealing with the domestic issues and also the foreign threat, but they're not.
I noticed you didn't include debates as one of the stages, and it appears the media makes the rules as to who attends a debate. Do you find that to be one of the stages?
I wouldn't call it a stage, but I think it's clearly a series of events that are part of the second and the third stage, the primary stage and the general election stage. The media today does have a lot to do with how that unfolds. The candidates, they'll also have a lot to do with that. They will insist on certain things. They will agree to a certain number of debates under certain terms. Back in the day, not too long ago, it used to be largely the League of Women Voters. It was kind of viewed as a nonpartisan group above politics and above partisanship who had a lot of say about how that would play out. But the parties and the media kind of came in and took it away from them because obviously they wanted to shape it in certain ways. So I look at that as a part, just like campaigning is a part. If I go to this Iowa State Pride, any event that I might do, I think that's part of that second stage, and then again, also the third stage.
As somebody that works in the Board of Elections, students want to work, have to be registered Democrat, Republican, or no party affiliation whatsoever. And you know the president's debate over here, the Green Party candidate got locked up on hostage property because he wouldn't let it compete.
Yeah.
But you're only allowed 3 voting slips, and then we have to spoil them, and then you have to go see a judge. Now we're going to get the chairman of an
I think the issue that you're raising is the fairness question for third parties. And clearly, it's incredibly hard for a third party to ever get traction in America. I'll cite 2 pieces of evidence for that. When was the last time we had a third party come to power in America? 1860. Basically 1/3 of our into our history, and since then, the remaining roughly 2/3 of our history, it hasn't changed at all. Why? Because it's really hard for a third party to get traction.
What's Barova's up there?
Well, but look what happened. Here's another measure. There are 535 members of Congress. Some of them, maybe 2, I don't know, are independents, meaning they're not associated with any party. But how many members of 535 come from a third party? 0. Why? One reason is because our electoral system makes it very hard for third parties to get traction and to prosper. So this again is a consequence of the design of your electoral system. You may think it's good to have more parties. Some people do and some people don't. There are problems with having more parties as well. So it just kind of depends on your take on that. But your electoral system largely will dictate whether you have a 2-party system or a multi-party system.
So in effect, you're saying that the system stinks, but it's the only one we have.
I will say that the system could be a lot more democratic, and I'm somebody who values democracy, and so I would like to see that happen. America is not the worst governing system in the world, and I think we could do better though, and I'd like us to do better.
Well, I could quote Churchill, or
I was
Churchill.
just about to, but you go ahead.
Churchill said that democracy is the worst system except for all the rest.
It's a great line, and I use it a lot, to be honest.
too.
And he was right about that. And we have a system that, there are a lot of other ways in which you can criticize American democracy for being not as democratic as it could be. Not least of which, for example, is the power of money in the system, right? The essence of democracy is that we all have an equal say. Well, that isn't the case, right? Rich people have a lot bigger say than you and I do. And there are a lot of other ways we could criticize American democracy. So I would say that we aspire to democracy. There are ways that we can really improve it if we were serious about it, and I wish we were.
So recently, Warren had opened about if she were to win the presidency, to actually start abolishing the Electoral College rule. If that process were to happen, how difficult would it be, or can it be something that we see in the near future?
Well, I think you're much more likely to see the compact come into fruition and you just do an end run. If you were to do it the only other way that I can think of, which is what everybody has been trying to do for centuries, through a constitutional amendment. So that's how you would do it. You would write up an amendment, you would create a replacement system, you would get both houses of Congress to pass that, and then you'd have to go out and get 38 states to ratify it. And if you did those things, that new system that you had written up in your amendment would become the new system replacing the Electoral College. But, like I said, good luck. It's pretty hard to call. Okay, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.